In 1847, an Irishman left home to settle in America on a farm in Wayne County, Michigan. He met his soulmate, and they began a family. Left with no better means of livelihood, the family decides to embrace farming. But unfortunately, when the man was old and could no longer farm, his little boy refused to take after his father's farming career. Unknown to the man, his son had an obsession with mechanics. This obsession would make him one of the most influential people in America's history. The Irish boy, Henry Ford, many years later created the first automobile that middle-class Americans could afford, converting automobiles from an expensive luxury into an accessible conveyance for all. This is the story of how a little boy went from farming to founding a multi-million-dollar automobile company. Henry Ford was born in Springwells Township, Wayne County, Michigan, on July 30th, 1863, to Mary Litigo and William Ford. Henry was the eldest of 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. Fortunately for young Henry, he encountered mechanics early enough. He played around with his neighbors' watches, and by the time he was 12, he could disassemble and put them back together. The neighbors would have seen him as one strange young little boy with a divine ability to repair watches. When Henry's father was growing old and feeble to work on the farm, he expected that Henry would take after him. Unfortunately, it turned out that Henry hadn't developed any love for farm work. Probably he wouldn't have known the way to the farm if it wasn't for his mom. Henry later wrote, "I never had any particular love for the farm. It was the mother on the farm I loved." With no interest in farming, he turned down the family business. He took up a job as an apprentice machinist in Detroit. However, after some years, Henry Ford returned to work on the family farm, and that experience gave his passion for science a leap. Henry's interest in mechanics grew into an obsession. On the farm, he learned how to operate Westinghouse steam engines, and the company soon discovered him and hired him to service their engines. With the knowledge he got from working with the Westinghouse and from watching the operation of a Nichols and Shepard road engine, Henry constructed a steam wagon and a steam car in his farm workshop. At this time, he was only 15, but that was just the beginning of the great innovations that would yet change America. In 1887, Ford built a 4-cycle model with a 1-inch bore and a 3-inch stroke, and thereafter began working on a 2-cylinder engine. At that time, gas engines began to gain traction in Europe, and more people, including Ford, sought to learn about this advanced technology. These gas engines were being manufactured in small quantities by a German engineer, Nicholas Otto. Henry Ford got the opportunity to work on these engines and appreciated their advantages over the steam engine. Unlike the steam engine, the gas engine provided an efficient process as a result of internal combustion. The gas engine starts quickly, and you wouldn't wait for as long as 30 minutes to heat the water before you could start working. It is also much lighter since it doesn't use a heavy boiler and moisture. It was an innovation that Henry fell in love with. However, he needed to learn so much about it since he was almost alien to this technology. He had worked with steam and metal all his life, whereas the gas engine was powered by electricity. In July 1891, Henry got an offer to work at the local branch of the Edison Illuminating Company of Detroit, and he grabbed it. It was like an answered prayer for him. The company was generating electricity for thousands of homes in Detroit, and the use of steam engines hadn't been so favorable, so Henry was a natural hire for them. The job also gave him ample time and funds to push his experiments on gasoline engines. Henry was so good at what he did that he rose to the rank of chief engineer in a short time. By 1896, he completed his first vehicle made of a frame, 4 wheels, and an ethanol-powered engine. He named the car Ford Quadricycle. After several test drives, Ford began to look for ways to improve the quadricycle. Aside from having only 2 gears, one for going forward and the other for reverse, the car had a fundamental challenge. It had no cooling system, making overheating a constant issue. Ford met with Thomas Edison and considered it an opportunity to learn more about electricity from the electricity guru himself. Edison was impressed by Ford's innovative spirit and encouraged him to improve on his quadricycle. Ford completed his second quadricycle in 1898, and afterward, a third version. On each version, he improved its design and functionality, including adding a cooling system. However, Henry later sold off his quadricycle for $200. A year later, Ford resigned from Edison's company to start his own company, which he called the Detroit Automobile Company. He was able to get many Detroit elites to invest in the company, including William Murphy of the Edison Company. Henry had a big plan for his new company. He was going to be the plug for delivery wagons, as he called it. Thankfully, by then, he already made connections with the most influential people in Detroit and he was going to take advantage of the relationships to get supplies for his automobile company. Henry hired 100 workers, and they began to work on the big project. However, the parts for manufacturing the delivery wagon came from other companies, which always took time to deliver to them, making production exceptionally slow and turnover poor. In fact, the company was only able to produce 20 wagons in its first 2 years of existence. The quality of the automobiles was not also up to par, and the cost was on the high end. That wasn't what Henry wanted, so the company hit the rock about 18 months after. The shareholders became sick and tired of Henry's constant new ideas that never seemed to work. They needed to get a passenger car out there as soon as they could to start turning in a profit, so they voted to get rid of him. Although the chairman of the company, Henry wasn't one of the major shareholders, and so he had no choice but to give up the company. The new head of the Detroit Automobile Company, Henry Leland, later changed the company's name to Cadillac Automobile Company. As the saying goes, winners never quit. Henry didn't let the way things turned out with his automobile company to deter him from chasing his passion. He went back to the drawing board to figure out a better approach to his automobile business. He eventually came up with the idea of turning cars from the property for the rich into a commodity everyone could afford. At the time, racing was becoming a common activity in America, and Henry thought it good to design horsepower racers. Partnering with a former racing cyclist, Tom Cooper, Ford produced the 80-plus horsepower racer 999, which Barney Oldfield was to drive to victory in a race in 1902. Ford teamed up with an old acquaintance, Alexander Y. Malcolmson, who was a coal dealer in Detroit. They formed a partnership, Ford and Malcolmson Limited, to manufacture automobiles. They leased a factory and contracted with a machine shop owned by the Dodge brothers, John and Horace E. Dodge, to supply them with parts to design inexpensive automobiles. Like many previous attempts, the partnership didn't survive the test of time. Sales were slow, and a problem arose when the Dodge brothers demanded payment for their first shipment. Malcolmson talked Ford into bringing the Dodge brothers into the company as co-founders as compensation for their money. The Dodge brothers, like Malcolmson's uncle John S. Gray, Malcolmson's secretary James Couzens, and two of Malcolmson's lawyers, John W. Anderson and Horace Rackham. On June 16, 1903, Ford and Malcolmson was reincorporated as the Ford Motor Company with $28,000 capital. Henry paid keen attention to improving his production process, getting his supply of parts directly from the Dodge Brothers Company. A month later, the first Ford car, the 2-cylinder 8-horsepower Model A, was assembled. Ford dedicated himself to the production of an efficient and reliable automobile that would be affordable for everyone. However, efficiency wasn't at its peak because only a few workers were involved and could not do so much in a day. The manual method wasn't bringing the kind of efficiency that Ford envisaged. Ford visited a slaughterhouse in Chicago, Swift & Company, and learned about the assembly line, which allowed for the work to be taken to workers rather than the worker moving to and around the vehicle. He decided to adopt it for his factory to boost industrial efficiency. He hired multiple workers and began to implement the assembly line. And just as he hoped, it worked. The company could now produce as many as 25 cars per day. Ford released the Model N, which became the best-selling car in the United States. By then, Ford has become the biggest automobile company in America. In the same year, Ford launched the Ford Manufacturing Company to produce engines and transmissions for the Ford cars to speed up the production process and perhaps save costs. However, what brought the breakthrough for the Ford Company was the Model T, which made its debut in October 1908. This time it wasn't about the cheapest, but the car was as strong as a rock, and with this singular feature, it beat its competitors. Within weeks after the Model T's release, Ford received 25,000 orders. But what actually happened? In 1907, Henry decided to start the production of vanadium steel. In fact, the furnaces in America couldn't reach the temperature needed to manufacture them. But although the production process was difficult, vanadium steel was twice as strong as ordinary steel while being lighter, so it was worth it. Henry was lucky to know the owners of a vanadium steel mine in Peru, Minas Ragra. The two brothers, Joseph and James Flannery, supplied vanadium steels to the U.S. government and other European countries for the construction of railroads, yet they were still left with an excess of it. They met Henry and made him an offer to supply him with vanadium steels for his company. He quickly agreed. Henry got supplies from the Flannery brothers to manufacture a much stronger version of the Model T cars, and as expected, people loved it. When it was obvious that the Model T was becoming a big deal, Henry built a second factory, the Highland Park Ford plant, to support the production of the Model T. He also employed another marketing strategy of making the car cost-efficient, and that idea was a blockbuster. From 1910, the production of the Model T skyrocketed to meet the increasing demands. By the next 6 years, he was building over 500,000 Model T cars. Almost everyone in America was using the Model T. This continued until the 1920s, when other automobile companies began to spring up. But by then, Henry Ford was already one of the richest Americans in history. Henry Ford resisted many technological innovations, including all-metal roofs and hydraulic brakes. However, in 1932, Ford dropped a low-price 8-cylinder engine car, the flathead Ford V8. During World War I, many automobile companies began going into the aviation business, and Ford was not left out. Ford's most successful aircraft was the Ford 4AT trimotor, often called the Tin Goose because of its corrugated metal construction. After the war, however, the Ford company returned to auto manufacturing. Ford later suffered several cardiovascular events and mental inconsistencies. Due to his health failing, he retired from the company presidency, handing it over to his grandson, Henry Ford II, in September 1945. He died on April 7, 1947, at the age of 83, of a cerebral hemorrhage at Fairlane, his estate in Dearborn. Henry's famous quote was, "There is no failure except failure to serve one's purpose." Purpose drove the 16-year-old Ford into exploring technology, and the Ford Company is a product of that obsession. Today, Ford is among the top 10 automobile companies in the world.